Hello, World History Groups, Colonel Gallagher. I'm going to give you the lesson on Asia now. It's a large lesson because we only have one chance with it. And if you look at my slides on teams dealing with Asia, the first slide you're going to see has two ships. One little small ship, one really giant ship. Now, I need to explain those because there's no caption for it or anything. The smaller ship was Columbus's. It's one of Columbus's ship. I think it's the Santa Maria, if I'm right. And it's one of the smaller ships. That's the Columbus. That's the ship Columbus came over on. The much larger ship next to it was a Chinese ship. That's the difference in scale to give you the understanding of China in the 14th century and into the 15th century. That'd be the 13th, or that'd be the 1500s. And China, its great admiral is a man named Zheng He, Zheng, capital He. Zheng He was purported to be about 6'8" tall. He was a Muslim. He had converted to Islam, and he traveled extensively throughout Asia. But the story goes deeper. There was a book written not too long ago, I'd say about 15 years ago, about Zheng He's travels. And the argument by this author is that evidence was found in Peru and other places of the New World arguing that Zheng He actually went around the globe. He was the first one to do so. The Chinese ships were much larger, they were much more luxurious. On them, they had farms, basically, orchards, which gave them fruits, and fruits were used to fight off scurvy, if you know anything about ocean travel. So Zheng He's ships and his fleet was much larger, more advanced than the European model. Now, what happened? That's the real question. China, as you look at it from the 900s up to around the 1400s, was without any question the dominant of all civilizations on the globe. They were the more advanced technologically and otherwise. And then a shift occurred really in the 1500s, 1600s, to where it shifted from the east to the west, from China as the more dominant civilization to Europe emerging. It's a shift that goes on for a couple hundred years. And what happened, if you look at my notes, is I have what I call the five keys to civilization. Now, these aren't mine. I took them from a really good historian. It made sense to me when I took a look at his evaluation of it. And he argued that there were these five items that you could use to define a greatness of a civilization, kind of the health, the status of it. And the first one in there is competition. In competition, I have a couple words in there. The first word is decentralization, which meant there's not a centralized government that is oppressive. That's the key. The decentralization then allowed for freedoms, really, basically, and so it encouraged competition in this society. And in China, this was very true, especially when you look at something called the civil service exams. It allowed people to move up in their station in life. That's why, if you also look at my notes, I have the Tong Society chart where there was the opportunity for peasants to move up socially if they received some of this schooling. Now, it would take a lot of money to hire one of these tutors in order to get the education, the knowledge to pass these civil service exams. And entire communities, entire villages would pool money together the best they could and try to send one person out of the village as their hope in order to move up in this society in the Tang Dynasty, and by doing so, that would be the hope that it would then elevate others out of the village as well. They could reach back and pull others up. This put a lot of pressure on the individual as they represented the village and they represented their family, and so this became kind of the Chinese view of education. The other one is science. The second one is science. Science is really, I kind of got it in there, the study of understanding and being able to control nature in some degree, understand the natural world, science. And the Chinese were well ahead of the Europeans in this area of science until once again it's going to shift. All these are going to shift back to Europe. And in science, especially, I put two words: military advantage. And this is going to be true when you see the Europeans come into China. As Europeans came into China, by the 16, 1700s, this had certainly shifted, and the Europeans show up with a much more advanced system of military. Gunpowder would be a good example of this. You can find scientific writings of people with calculations on gunpowder and how to improve military technology. This gave a decidedly significant advantage to the Europeans. You don't only see this science being applied on the east into the eastern regions of Japan, where the Europeans are going to come into there and into China, but also in the New World when the conquistadores of Spain showed up. They had serious advantages in that area of military technology. The third one's medicine. In the areas of medicine, this is health and life expectancy. It's a branch of science, and medicine allows us to live better and longer. Especially thinking now with the coronavirus. Look at this. Look how we're really going to have our hands tied because the search is on for this vaccine. Once the vaccine is found, then life can normalize. You have risks if you don't have proper medicine and proper access to this. And all these, when you take a look at this, is what's going to give the advantage to the West eventually. They're going to adopt these and advance in these areas. If you think of people in the West that later on in the 1800s that go down into Africa and these other regions like that, and they apply the medicine there, it helped people to defeat diseases that had before, wiped out groups of people. The fourth area is property rights. Now, property rights is a foundational principle for the government. And when you look at this, it's the rule of law that is the basis really for representative government. Because I own property, I need the government. And this goes back to a guy named John Locke. Locke is the one who really formulated this, and he's not the founder of it, but he's the idea of formulating this in a very sophisticated way that because I own this property right here, it's mine because I mix my labor with it, he would say. And therefore, I buy it, it becomes mine. But this now becomes part of me just as much as anything else. I need the government because if somebody stole it or took it away, then I would need the courts and the judges and so on like this. And so, because of government, property becomes essential. And because property rights are so important, it's difficult in argument to separate your property and your rights. They go together. And so there's property rights. You can see this from different civilizations. In the West, you begin to see the ideas of property rights. Individual property rights becomes very important, especially when you study American history. It's not so much the land of opportunity. I always argue you flip it around. It's the opportunity for land, which is social status and the ability to have independence, really, when you think about it. This is my own land and I own it for myself. There's a tremendous individuality in this. But at the same time, when you study property rights in Latin American countries, as you move into the 1800s, it's not the same. And therefore, that is the reason why you see such differences, arguably so by economic historians specifically, between the regions. That's one example. And then the last one's work ethic. Work ethic is a fifth one that's identified, and it's really interesting because most people would think, was that really that important? Yes. It's a moral framework for how we operate with each other and in our own society. In fact, all five go together, you can argue. The competition, the first one, is not exclusive. It goes with property rights and it goes with work ethic, you could argue, and definitely see this, come together. Science, think of patents. If I had the ability to develop a vaccine, let's say to cure the coronavirus, then this would be a patent I could get, and this would be enriching myself as well as the rest of everybody else. So work ethic is really enhances productivity. And you see this. So these five, when you think of those five, and you look at the slide, that's what China really had going for itself, but then it's going to turn its back on this. And this is kind of the idea of the history moving back and forth. And it's because of two things. And I always say you have two eyes. So think of it this way: institutions and ideas. Whenever you get into the concepts that we're developing right here and discussing, it always has to do with institutions and ideas. How so? Well, for example, when you go back to that civil service exam, an example, someone can move up in society if they improve in education and status. Then, if you think about that a little bit, the institution of schooling. School, education is an institution. It's an institution really being disrupted right now because of the coronavirus. But that institution can only be disrupted if you allow it to be so, I would argue, because education can be developed on your own. Having your own library, I'm going to argue, is an advantage. Having access to internet is an advantage. These are all now really institutions in our own world now. Books, okay, libraries are institutions if you think of it that way. So institutions are very important foundational pieces for all these five things we're talking about, including when you talk about science and medicine. You can probably think of some right now. The other part is ideas. Ideas. Now, ideas if you look at it, are really there. If you think of the word competition, you think of the word science, you think of the word medicine, any of those we looked at, they're ideas. Ultimately, property rights, like I mentioned with Locke, is an idea. And so it becomes, that's the foundational basis, in other words, for these civilizations. China's basis for its improvement and its really excellence, its greatness as a civilization, was the adherence to these fives as the argument. What you see when the West begins to move out of that medieval stage, it's the five. And when you think of these five, that's what we're going to really look at when we look at the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a spirit of competition when you think about it. It has isms attached to it, ideas. One of the isms is capitalism. And capitalism is very important because, and I'll get to this, when we get to the Renaissance, you'll see a painting and it has the money changer and his wife, and he's counting out this coin, but he has all these goods around him that he had bought, and they now make his life better and easier. And this is important when you look at Asia versus the West. It is the East starting to set and the West starting to rise. And the only way you can answer the reason for the West to rise is the adoption of these five things. These five things, these ideas, is changing government. And these institutions are the result of the interaction between the people and their government. These institutions and these ideas, that's the foundation of the Renaissance. The Renaissance are about institutions and ideas ultimately, when you look at it. One of the most important things in a Renaissance is going to be the university, because a lot of what's taught in the universities is medieval thought. That's going to change. And universities education is always about new models. Aren't we going through a new model today? It's an adaptability. And that's really the truth. If you don't adapt, then what happens? So the adaptability is really critical, that this becomes a design that we adopt new institutions and ideas. But the institutions and ideas will have an impact on civilization. Yes, and it's obvious. Even when you look at it today, we're experiencing a new model today. Okay, now is this permanent? Probably not. Most people want it to be because we're used to the old ideas and institutions, aren't we now? I am. I'm comfortable that way. But there is something to be said for interaction as well. And this is something very important for the human species. So when you look at the ideas of what I have in Asia, I've got a lot in there. And I mentioned about Japan and China. They're very different. China is a more open society when you look at it in the Tang Dynasty specifically. And then when you look at the other society, Japan is feudalistic, very closed, very militaristic. The real power in the Japanese society, you had the emperor at the top, but he's really a figurehead. He didn't really exhibit any kind of power. It's the shogun. The shogun is the true power in and he's a military dictator. He's a military leader, a commander, and then supreme military commander. Then you have the shogun. Then below the shogun is the daimyo. A daimyo is a large landowner that works for the samurai. This is a feudal structure. There's several daimyos under a shogun. There's only one shogun, but there's several daimyos. And underneath daimyos, they have these groups of people that are knights. Technically, they're called samurai. And samurai owe their allegiance to daimyos. Now, daimyos owe their allegiance to shogun, but the feudal system is not very stable. You can have military takeovers. You can have daimyos that overthrow shoguns and things like this, which did happen in Japan. The most famous shogunate in Japanese history was the Tokugawa shogunate. And the Tokugawa shogunate ruled for about 300 years. And so for 300 years, the Tokugawa, the greatest of them all, was Tokugawa Ieyasu. He's in your reading, so don't be too worried about the spelling. Ieyasu. He had these big ears. The Dutch wrote about him a lot. The Dutch had a lot of interaction with the Japanese. The Dutch got an island made just for them. Now, see, the Japanese didn't want any outsiders because of religious issues. Okay, they tried to have the Spanish and the Portuguese come in so the Japanese could kind of learn things from them. But the Spanish and the Portuguese started to convert Japanese, and they converted them to Catholicism. Now, the problem is very simple. The shogun and the emperor asked one simple question: who's this pope? Pope above shogun? No, no, no. So they had to go. So the Dutch they allowed, and they gave them a couple rules. And the Japanese built this man-made island called Dejima, and it's in my notes, Dejima. And I had a student a long time ago say, "Well, can we see Dejima today?" No, because it was in a place called Nagasaki Harbor. The Americans blew it up with the atomic bomb. So no, there's no more Dejima. But Dejima is this man-made island that they put the Dutch on, and they can only allow, I think, 20 Dutch in a year. And the Dutch had some rules. One, no Bibles. Two, no women. Because they said, what do women have to do with business? And then you got to understand the time period and the era. Okay, and so they stayed on that island, and once a year, the shogun would allow them to come in to the capital. And the capital at that time was a place called Edo, E-D-O, and the Dutch would parade through these cities, and everybody would watch them because to the Japanese they're barbarians. They call them. They're different. They're foreigners. They're inferior. They don't have the honorable structure that the Japanese did. What the Dutch were worried about was being merchants. To the Japanese, the merchants was the lowest class. Lowest class. They were parasitic in their mind. There was no honor in the merchants. They argued. They worked off of others. They didn't do and produce anything on their own. So the Japanese view of the world and the Dutch view of the world are very different, including the Japanese view and the Chinese view. The Japanese adopted a lot of things from the Chinese. They adopted, for example, the pagoda, the building, the style of the building. They adopted that from the Chinese. The Japanese adopted the wonderful thing, the ceremony, the thing the samurai liked the most, the tea ceremony. They adopted from the Chinese. Okay. The one thing they did not adopt from the Chinese was the civil service system, the system for moving up. They said no. To the Japanese, it's a static, rigid, feudalistic structure based on a military system, which is based on a system of honor. This is where you get whatever term you want to use, but I use seppuku, seppuku, which is the belly slitting. Okay, this is the harakiri. This is the righteousness that you if you did something wrong. Okay, in the Japanese code, the samurai would not want to dishonor, so they would do this ritualistic ceremony. But the samurai, in a sense, held in the middle of it the truth and the understanding of Japanese honor. And they had a different code for different things. Okay, the Bushido code is what I'm referring to, orally trying to explain it to you. But I'm trying to give you a panoramic view of Asia between the ideas of China, Japan, and then the influence with the West and the shift that they had from especially China into the West. All right, and the last thing, and I've got it in my notes, is Korea, and I know I'm running really close on time. Korea's got a fascinating, beautiful history, beautiful country, mountainous in some parts, beautiful country, beautiful trees, beautiful land, unfortunately divided today. And Korea went through three specific empires of its own and ended up becoming what you call a shrimp among whales. Korea between China and Japan and endured the invasion of both at different times. So they're not big buddies. Okay, historically speaking, the Koreans had to throw the Chinese out several times, and they also fought against the Japanese in what became known as the Porcelain Wars. In Korea, you had this beautiful, beautiful white, pure white porcelain called kaolin, Kaolin. The Japanese invaded Korea to get control of these people, these masters who knew how to use the kaolin, and brought them back to Japan to manufacture this beautiful pottery, which by ironic, go all the way full circle, ended up in the hands of the Dutch. That's why the Dutch were willing to do whatever they had to do to maintain relations with the Japanese, because they could get hold of this kaolin, they could get hold of this wonderful porcelain, and sell it back in Europe for huge amounts of money. All right, so it's kind of an interesting trade network, but it's an interesting dynamic of learning from each other in a way, selectively taking what you want, but then rejecting the rest of it. But in the case of anything, the five keys to civilization are absolutely essential. The idea of competition, the idea of science, the idea of medicine, the idea of property rights, and then the fifth and the final one. Okay, and you know what it should be: work ethic. Yeah. And work ethic does make a difference. You can see this specifically in the world even to today. Okay, hopefully you're doing fine. Make sure you keep watching these videos. Check in email by attendance. Okay, and I sent an email out, and I'm gonna countermand it. Don't worry. I want you to really send an email. Okay, it's more important. I think you watch these videos and take care of yourself. I just want to make sure you're okay. If you're okay, I'm okay. If you're not okay, you need to email me and talk to me. Okay, otherwise I have no idea. All right, thank you. I miss you guys. I can't wait to see you again on November 2nd.